Okay, boxing fanatics, welcome to the 23rd episode of the podcast. I'm delighted to be joined once again by Mr. Oscar Pick. Oscar, well, last night, I think going into that fight between Berlanga and Sheeraz, I think it's fair to say that going into people were a little bit on the fence a little bit, because of Sheeraz's previous fight against Adamez. I think he went down in a lot of people's estimations. And I think going into that, people were unsure because he's moving up in weight. Berlanga's massive at 168. There was all these intangibles and, people weren't really sure what was going to happen. But Sheeraz proved a lot of people wrong last night, dropping Berlanga twice en route to a fifth round stoppage. What's your initial reaction to Sheeraz beating Berlanga last night?
Yeah, honestly, it surprised a lot of people, and that obviously includes myself, to be fair, because I had a lot of confidence in Sheeraz prior to the fight. I think a lot of people saw that Adames performance rather, and people are quick to write him off after that.
Mm.
Let's not forget, he didn't lose that fight. I know most people thought that he did, but he was still, competitive during certain moments against a fully fledged world champion who's, been at the top of his game for quite some time. So, given the fact that he was struggling so much at middleweight, and obviously, the training setup wasn't as good as it is now under Andy Lee. I
Mm.
think, given what he was kind of going through at the time, you have to look back on that and think, well, actually, he did well to produce that type of performance when he was kind of, competing against so many challenges, especially the weight cut, because I think, yeah, for me to remember Sheeraz down at super welterweight is just like, that just seems like another planet, it just seems insane that he was able to even boil himself down to that limit, but he somehow managed to do it. And then even middleweight was just, you could see every time he stepped onto the scale was like it was just
Mm.
a really depleted version of himself, obviously. But up at super middleweight, he just looks, like an absolute beast, to be fair. And I think with Sheeraz, I was really impressed with how he approached the fight, during the build-up. Obviously, you got Edgar Berlanga there, who's quite a fiery character, and
Mhm.
he was looking to maybe get under his skin at times. I thought Sheeraz responded to that really well. He handled all of his fight week commitments really well. I think I even noticed in certain interviews he just had the right amount of nerves before the fight. I feel like I noticed his demeanor. Obviously, he's quite a typically laid back character, but you could tell he was a little bit nervous about heading into this fight because he was literally going straight back into the deep end
Mm.
against Belanga. And as you say, there were so many uncertainties attached to this fight. Um, Belanga's always going to be a dangerous opponent. He's a big puncher. He's obviously got his limitations. He's
Mhm.
not the best technically. He's not got the greatest defense in the world, but he's dangerous. And for Shiraz to go in there and knock him out is, an absolute statement. I think. Looking back, you could even say, it was a good style matchup for him. I think Frank Warren even admitted that in his post-fight interview. I saw he spoke to one of the YouTube channels and he was like, we picked Belanga as an opponent for a reason. Because,
Mm.
on his day, Shiraz can look sensational against that type of fighter. But that doesn't take anything away from the fact that Shiraz, he had to go through that psychological battle after the Adames fight of, like, do I deserve to be at that level? Like, he would have had these thoughts to himself, and I think maybe a few doubts along the way. uh, so for him to go in there and produce a performance like that, given what he's had to go through, I think it's really impressive. I think yeah, it's an incredible display, and obviously with him being trained by Andy Lee now, that
Mm.
should only be a good thing for him moving forward.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Absolutely. And I think you made a good point about Carlos Adamez, actually. We have to remember Adamez is more proven than Belanga. I mean, I know he's a weight below, but Adamez is, like you said, he's a fully fledged world champion. He's won a world title. He's beaten some good names. Berlanga, I feel like as well, we still don't really know how good Berlanga is, to be honest. I still don't know where to kind of place him because he's kind of riding off that Canelo performance. It's like that's becoming a victory lap now. If you go 12 rounds of Canelo, you've accomplished something or something like that. So I guess going in as well, yeah, we still don't know how good Belanga is. But I think you're definitely correct with what your assessment of him. Yeah, I think offensively he is a big puncher, but yeah, technically there is a lot of deficiencies there. He's way too open, and Shiraz is very crisp. He's very very crisp, and I think. Because I think we have to give actually credit to Adamez. Adamez actually gave him some angles to think about. I remember watching that fight. He was a lot shorter than Shiraz, and the way he was moving his head and stuff like that. The skill level was on a completely different level to Belanga. So I'm not. It's actually not surprising when you look at it like that. That he was able to tee off Berlanga a lot easier. As for how Shearer's looks, yeah, I mean he looks really quite skinny and lanky, doesn't he? I mean, I think at 168 he's actually looking like more filled out. It's like looking more natural, like a guy who's 6 foot three like that. He should be kind of more filled out. And yeah, no doubt he's gonna be a bit more. He's gonna be healthier. And I still think he's gonna be because of his height. He's still gonna be like a decent, a big 168 pounder because of how tall he is. Um, so yeah, I mean, is it fair to say that? I don't know, Shearer has kind of redeemed himself a little bit. I mean, it's funny, boxing's one of these sports where, if when you're winning, I remember even myself, if I'm being honest, when I saw Shearer, like, when he destroyed like Tyler Denny in 3 rounds and stuff like that, I was thinking, oh my God, who's going to beat this guy? And then you watch him against Adamez, and then you think, okay, is he really as good as he's being kind of sold to us as? But overall, do you think this has been kind of, I guess, yeah, redemption for Shearer? Like all of a sudden, do you think he's like back up in people's estimations?
I think so. For me, he is definitely because with Shiraz, and you mentioned, some of his previous performances, and I remember watching him. It was actually on a do you remember during lockdown, during COVID times, where Frank Warren was putting those shows on? I think it was a BT studio at the time, those
Mhm.
behind closed doors shows with no crowds or anything.
Mhm.
I remember him, Shiraz, fighting on the undercard of Joe Joyce on one of those, little pot shows. And obviously, there's no atmosphere. So when he got in the ring and ended up knocking out his opponent, I guess that kind of added to it. But I remember watching Shearers at the time and thinking, God, like he looks like something special here.
Mhm.
And fast forward several fights, he's one of those fighters that you do just keep an eye on, and then he beats the likes of Liam Williams, as you
Mhm.
say, Tyler Denny. That great performance against Austin Ammo Williams, which I
Mhm.
don't think he's got enough credit for that really.
Yeah.
I think he's shown an enormous amount of talent in previous performances, and I always looked at him and I thought, right, he's a really special prospect that we've got on these British shores. He's head and shoulders above most of these prospects that we see on the lower down on the undercards.
Mhm.
So I always had that level of expectation of him to reach the pinnacle of the sport. But then, in terms of finding that extra layer of class, I guess, in terms of, getting to that really elite level, you need something a little bit extra. And I think with Shiraz, what I wasn't sure about him after that Adames fight was whether he had the mentality
Mhm.
to, basically respond to that setback in a way that champions and, particularly talented individuals do. But I think, going straight back into the deep end against someone like Belanga, regardless of his technical flaws, it's still such a risky fight. He was literally rolling the dice by going in there with Belanga. He didn't know whether, like how. I mean, how often do you see a fighter sort of take a setback? I know he didn't get beat by Diamonds, but it could be seen as a setback given the backlash he got for that performance,
Yeah.
given the fact that in most people's eyes he did lose a fight.
Mhm.
How often do you see a fighter then go straight back into what most people thought was a 50-50 fight? Some people even had Belanga as a favourite going into that one. So I
Yeah.
think for him to do that was a really ballsy move, to be fair. And it showed me that he's got a certain mentality where he believes that he can, become a world champion. He believes he can be at the pinnacle of his sport. And he showed that with, a sensational performance. There's not many people who I think, could kind of go through that psychological battle with themselves, that internal struggle, and then kind of go out there and, shine under the bright lights in the way that he did. So I think he showed, a lot of minerals last night, and I think that only like the fact that he's passed the test, so to speak, in terms of the mental side of the game. I think he's now looking like a much more complete fighter. The fact that you've got this mental side, but then you've also got the natural talent, the natural athleticism, the boxing brain. I think he's looking like a much more complete product at this moment in his career.
Absolutely. And again, it's another point, guys. We always refer about the Adames fight, but honestly, in the Adames fight, he did look a bit sorry for himself. He looked sorry for himself in that fight, and you can't really blame people for kind of doubting him after that fight and wondering if he has it to really be at the elite level. But like you said, ballsy fight against Berlanga, and yeah, he passed it. He passed it with flying colors. And also, what he did do, he did something that Canelo did that Canelo couldn't do. Canelo didn't even come really close to doing it. If my memory is correct, Canelo I think dropped Berlanga, was it once, and never
Yeah,
really,
once in the third round, I think.
yeah, never really
Yeah.
came close to knocking him out. Whereas Sheeraz, I mean, the way he was teeing off on him was just, I mean, in a sadistic way, it was just beautiful to watch. So crisp, the punches, so sharp, so powerful, so accurate. And yeah, when he lets his hands go, Sheeraz, it's lovely to watch. He's actually very athletic, to be honest. He's extremely athletic. He's a real beast when he lets his hands go. And obviously he's got that thunderous jab as well, which everyone likes to talk about as, an amazing punch and stuff like that. Do you take anything into the fact that he did something that Canelo didn't? I mean, I know Canelo, to be honest, I mean, we don't want to turn this into a Canelo topic, but Canelo's obviously hasn't maybe looked his best in the last few years. But do you think that's something to say that, he like, with a common opponent, he basically, yeah, he done way better than what Canelo did against Berlanga. Is there anything in that, or is it more, or do you think it's more just like styles make fights, and we shouldn't look into that too much?
I think there's a bit of styles make fights, obviously, but I think I've been quite vocal in terms of saying that I believe Canelo. I just think his feet are shot to pieces at this stage in his career. Like based on every single performance since that Bivol defeat, he's just looked miles away from what he was before that fight. Interestingly enough, the fact that we talk about how fighters respond to defeats, how they
Mhm.
respond to setbacks. The fact that every time I've seen him in the ring after that Bivol fight, he's not looked anywhere near what he was before. And he was a beast before that fight. Like he would explode into range, really fast, snappy combinations. He doesn't look anything like that anymore. And I think that's partly because of, maybe age, maybe a bit wear and tear, maybe partly because of that Bivol defeat. So I think with him looking the way he did against Belanga, might be more of a reflection of where Canelo's at in his career at the minute. But then, with someone like Sheeraz, I think he is just more of a natural puncher, to be fair. Even when he's not loading up on those shots, they still carry an enormous amount of venom, and I think that's one of the telltale signs where you see, these big punch. I think Artur Beterbiev is a good example of that, where it doesn't even look like he's putting anything behind the shots. Golovkin's another great example
Yeah,
where
yeah.
they're almost, like they hardly look like they're rotating with the hips or anything. They almost look like arm punches, but they
Mhm.
carry so much power, so much impact
Heavy
behind those
hands.
shots. I'm
Mhm.
not saying Shiraz is the same level of puncher as Beterbiev and Golovkin, but I'm saying, you can tell he's a natural puncher just by the fact that he's able to have such an effect and, not even really load up on the shots. So I think, yeah, obviously with him just being maybe a more spiteful, finisher as well than Canelo. That might have had something to do with the two contrasting performance. But again, yeah, with Canelo, I've got my own sort of thoughts about him at this stage, and it would have been interesting to have seen Canelo, that same Canelo that smashed Caleb Plants to bits, and Billy Joe Saunders, like that same guy against Belanga would might have been a different story. But yeah, I guess we'll never know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I guess Canelo again, yeah, he's become a little bit of like a plodder, Canelo, in some ways. I remember obviously he was a lot younger, but I remember the Canelo that used to have such amazing head movement, and like you said, the way he just explodes in and out of range. It was a very different fighter to be. He was just more athletic, more explosive, and maybe, Father Time is undefeated, and maybe, he's just not as explosive. Well, he evidently isn't. And we're talking about power. I feel like with Canelo, he puts a lot into the shot. I don't necessarily think it's easy power. I think he's loading up on every shot. Whereas, like you said, like Beterbiev, um, Sheeraz, Golovkin, it's like more heavy hands. Like they just throw a jab out, it stings you because there's so much. The hands are just heavy. Just heavy, heavy hands. But yeah, so Berlanga does have power for sure. Does have power. In pure boxing style, though, I mean, this is typical, especially with the emergence of Turkey. They're already talking about a Canelo versus Shiraz fight, even though Canelo's going to fight Terence Crawford in September. They seem to love to, plan way, 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 way ahead. Obviously, it's very early days. Obviously, a lot can change, but let's just talk hypothetically. Hypothetically, right now, how do you see Shiraz doing against Canelo? I mean, I think it's fair to say, Shiraz is, we know he done a much better job on Belanga. If that fight was to happen right now, how do you see that going? Do you think he's in that kind of elite level yet, or do you reckon he needs maybe another fight, closer to that level to kind of compete with Canelo? Because let's be honest, Belanga's no way. I know he went 12 rounds with Canelo, but he's nowhere near. He's not an elite fighter, Belanga. So it's like it's hard to tell again. Do you reckon Sheeran maybe needs like an in-between fight before he fights Canelo? Someone who's maybe not elite, but towards that kind of that level.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I look at that super middleweight division, and there's so many interesting fights that he could be involved with. We saw Christian and Billy not that
Oh
long
yeah.
ago. He looks like a real, great fan-friendly fighter. I could imagine him against Sheeraz. That would be a really, that would be a Tom v Tom fight as opposed to Tom
Yeah.
and Jerry
Yeah.
type matchup. But yeah, you've also got obviously Diego Pacheco who's fighting soon. You got Olays Iglesias, who's a
Oh
bit of a
yeah.
danger man, to be fair. It's quite a stacked division, really, at kind of world level and fringe world level. So there's plenty of really interesting matchups he could get involved with. But obviously the Canelo fight is a big one. And I think, if it was Canelo who, like I said, was beating Caleb Plant, Billy Joe Saunders, then it would be a completely different outcome. But
Mm.
just because I feel like Canelo's deteriorated that much in recent years, I'd actually give Shearer a fairly decent chance in that fight. I
Mm.
think I think Canelo would maybe, bamboozle him a little bit with his just, his experience, his sort of he's still got great IQ to be fair, Canelo. It's just like he's reached a stage where
Mhm.
even though he's got that great boxing brain, he's not able, his body that isn't able to carry out what his mind is telling it to.
Mm.
Um, and I think, Shearer's could potentially um, take advantage of that and, capitalize on Canelo kind of being at the tail end of his career. So it's actually, fairly interesting fight. I know a lot of people would pick Canelo, but I wouldn't be so quick to, go with that prediction. And I think it's still a sellable fight, even if Canelo does lose to Crawford, which I think that he might. I
Mm.
think, because Canelo's got this deal with Turkey where he's fighting X amount of times in 2026. That's what's planned anyway. And I think at this stage, Canelo, it's difficult to know. Like obviously, he's still a fierce competitor and he's still, hungry to win. But at the same time, I do feel like a lot of these fights now at this stage are just cash outs, really. Like I think he's looking at the money. He lives a certain lifestyle where he needs to, fight on a semi-regular basis, and in order to, keep that lifestyle going. I know he plays a lot of golf, and he probably, goes on a lot of nice, lavish holidays. So I think that might have something to do with, part of the deterioration that we've seen from Canelo in recent years. But also his body's just not necessarily up to it anymore. I don't think anyway. So I think I'd
Mm.
actually probably I don't know about a prediction for that fight, but I'd give Shearer quite a good chance.
Mhm, mhm. Well, interestingly, I mean, Shearaz is a lot taller than Canelo, so it'd be another one of those. But then again, so is William Skull. I think William Skull was like over 6'2", and he just ran the whole night. I mean, he's I don't know, he's the king of the Jerrys, isn't he? After that performance, whereas Shearaz is definitely a Tom. Is definitely a Tom. So It's funny how we're going to be using these terms a lot now. Who's a Tom?
I
Who's
know.
a
I was just thinking that
Tom now?
I was massively critical of, that even being used in boxing, but then you find yourself kind of, you know, using it that terminology. It's weird, but yeah.
But it's a good one to be honest. It's actually good terminology because it's quite simple, isn't it? Like who's a Tom? Who's a Jerry? But I think we're going to see a lot more Toms. I think like last night was a good advert for boxing last night overall. But let's talk a little bit Belanga. Obviously, Belanga, he talks a lot. He like you said, he was trash talking a lot in that, in the build up. He always does. I mean, that you need someone to sell the fight, and he definitely does. He's very cocky. He's very, very out there. He's very flashy. But where does he go after this? The perception is that he's massive for 168. Do you reckon the natural thing to do? I mean, this tends to happen when guys lose a few fights. Do you reckon the natural thing for him to do is just to move up in weight? Should he just go up to 175 pounds? Could you argue that maybe with Bivol, Better Biev, maybe, somewhat on the way out, they're probably gonna have a trilogy, then retire. Then you have really Benavidez, obviously Yard, um, Callum Smith if he still wants to be around. What do you think? Where does Berlanga go from here? Like, should he stay at 168? Should he move up? I mean, I think one of the commentators said he could even end his career at cruiserweight. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised because guys always move up in weight. But how do you see things with Berlanga? What should he do really at this point?
I think he could move up in weight, but I don't see him winning a world title at 175 pounds. Who's he got to beat, Bivol or Beterbiev? I don't see, I don't see him getting past either of those two. But no, or Bivol Benavidez even. Sorry, but
Yeah, because Bivol and Batavia, they might retire. I don't know, Bivol's a bit younger, but I think they're on their way out. So it's more Benavidez,
yeah.
I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is with Belanga is I think he's got obviously a certain ceiling, and I don't see him winning a world title anytime soon. But I see him being a real sort of high value type fighter because obviously there is a bit of delusion to what he does. When you hear some of the stuff he's saying in the build up, you don't know really how authentic it is. And obviously after that Canelo fight, it's just bizarre the way he's kind of celebrating, but after losing to Canelo. But yeah, he's one of these guys where equally, when he's actually in the ring, he's immensely brave. Like even like in that Hamzah Sheeraz fight, he got up, every single time, I think, didn't he?
Yeah.
And you saw him when he, got put down heavy and he starts bashing his gloves together
Yeah,
and
yeah.
he's like cheering himself up. I think, he's clearly still got a lot of value as like fringe world level type guy. And he could be in some fun matchups. I know he's had a bit of beef with some of the American guys, whether that's Caleb Plant or
Yeah.
the Charlos. I think there's been a bit of back and forth. So those type of matchups, they're still sellable fights. You stick them on an undercard somewhere, and they probably do quite well. And you know what you're getting with Belanga. He does what he says on the tin, and I think yeah, he can. I don't see him obviously becoming a world champion. I think he potentially could, like, given the right opportunity. But um, yeah, whether that's at 168 pounds or whether it's at 175, that doesn't really matter. I don't think because I don't see him probably winning a world title. But if there's some, fun fights that he can be at in like heavyweight or super middleweight, then I'm sure he can still, have a decent career and probably make a lot of money for himself.
Yeah. Personally, I'd like to see the Caleb Plant fight now because Caleb Plant's coming off a loss. Belanga's also coming off a loss. They both fought Canelo. I think now's the time to make that fight. I don't think Caleb Plant has that many fights left, to be honest. Especially after the last loss. So I think, that could be a good cash out for either of them. I know Belanga's a bit younger than Caleb Plant. I think he's still in his 20s, isn't he? I think he's 27 or 28. So he's still young. He's still quite young in the game, to be fair. And I think you're right. I could see Belanga being recycled quite a lot, to be fair. That's maybe one way of putting it. I can see him being maybe used as, a fighter to, challenge the up and coming guys, or maybe he'll just be like rebuilt, because he does. I think he does sell, so maybe he'll just be rebuilt and yeah, just rebuild, maybe face some lesser contenders. Then he'll jump into a bigger fight again. I can imagine maybe even having like a few knockover jobs, get the hype back up, and then and then maybe he jumps in again. But I think the plant fight, they're both coming off losses. Why not? Finally, what do you about Shearaz? I mean, it's funny we talk about his weight, but like he with his career, where do you see him like ending up basically, like weight wise? Because he's obviously quite tall, and I think his frame is quite big. Like, do you see him even going up to 175 cruiserweight in the future, or do you reckon he should kind of do you reckon 168 is his kind of his ceiling and is his ideal weight?
I think his limit would be 175, but I think he should, he said it himself. He wants to stay at 168 pounds for, good 2 or 3 years
Mhm.
before thinking about moving up. And I think that's probably quite a sensible option. He can cause a lot of fighters a lot of problems in that division. I think his physical advantages will be slightly compromised if he was to move up to light heavyweight, just because those guys are they're big lumps up there. You
Yeah.
even look at the likes of, Anthony Yard.
So
The
yeah.
fact that he's been making light heavyweight for as long as he has is crazy, and he's an absolute unit, that guy.
Mhm.
So I don't think Shearers would have the same strength or even, potency behind his punches because
Mhm.
those type of attributes are definitely, they're manipulated a lot more at super middleweight, and I think he can get the best out of himself in that division. He's not absolutely killing himself to make the weight. He still has to do a weight cut, I'd imagine, because he's that big.
Mhm.
But it's a far more healthy weight than obviously middleweight. And yeah, I think he could spend a good. Well, I could see him spending 3 or 4 years down at that weight and probably become a world champion. I think he's definitely capable of that.
I think that's a good point. I think a lot with Shearer is his size, to be fair. He's obviously very good technically as well, but it's true, it is his size that actually gives him that extra kind of oomph because he is so big and he is so rangy. He's got those long limbs. So yeah, remains to be seen. But yeah, congratulations to Hamzah Sheeraz on a great win. And yeah, Berlanga, whether you like him or not, I think he's one of those guys you're gonna watch. You're probably gonna tune in because he talks a lot. So I guess we look forward to seeing him back. I think it's inevitable that he'll be back. All right, guys. Well, look, thanks a lot for listening to this episode. As always, if you like this episode, please like, comment, subscribe, and yeah, we'll catch you on the next one. Cheers.